The last known image of Sarah Jenkins is a flicker in time, a grainy, sun-bleached photograph that captures the kind of carefree optimism only found on the cusp of adulthood. She stands beside a beat-up Chevrolet, a backpack slung over her shoulder, her thumb already thrust into the passing Texas wind. It was the summer of 1995, a season of sweltering heat and boundless possibility. And Sarah, at 21, was heading west, chasing a horizon that promised a new life. No one could have known, gazing upon that innocent smile, that this journey was already doomed, that the vast, silent expanse of the Lone Star State was about to swallow her whole. The initial disappearance, a routine missing person report, filed by a frantic mother who simply felt the sudden, terrifying absence of her child, would remain a cold case for 2 long, agonizing decades. And then a small, dark revelation, an almost impossibly thin thread of DNA evidence, would emerge from the most unexpected place imaginable. A vial of dried tattoo ink, the final macabre signature of a truth far more terrifying than a simple, vanishing act. The early investigation was frustratingly thin, built on the shifting sand of travelers' rumors and half-remembered sightings. Sarah Jenkins was a ghost in the machine of the highway system. She had called her mother from a payphone near Amarillo on July 14th, reporting that she had found a ride with a seemingly genial man driving a long-haul truck. This was the last verifiable contact. Investigators established a timeline that was a study in frustrating linearity. The hitchhiking began in Galveston, progressed through Dallas, and stalled with chilling finality, somewhere between Amarillo and Albuquerque. The trucker, described vaguely as having dark hair and a heavy-set build, was never identified. Police scoured truck stops, motel registries, and rest areas, painting a blurry portrait of a missing young woman and an even blurrier one of her possible abductor. The wilderness of the Texas Panhandle, a landscape of scrub brush and endless sky, offered no witnesses, no physical evidence, and absolutely no comfort. Her backpack was not found. Her possessions, a worn copy of Kerouac, a cheap digital camera, a silver locket, all vanished with her. The case quickly moved from a high-priority search to a file on a cold shelf. Another tragic statistic in the countless miles of American highway that serve as a silent graveyard for the unwary. The grief of the Jenkins family settled into a dull, persistent ache, the kind of sorrow that had no corpse to mourn, only a perpetual, agonizing question mark. Detectives would periodically re-interview the few existing contacts, a ritual of dredging up the same old details, all leading back to the same dead end. The vast, empty road near the New Mexico border, where Sarah Jenkins simply ceased to be. The vastness of the land was a terrifying accomplice. It was a place where a person could disappear forever, where the wind could erase footprints in a matter of hours, and where the silence itself seemed to actively conspire to keep secrets. The emotional drain on the lead investigator, Detective Mark Kinsley, was profound. He carried the weight of Sarah's lost potential like an invisible burden, the file a constant reminder of failure. He had a daughter Sarah's age, and the mental image of her trusting wave before stepping into a stranger's vehicle haunted his sleep. The case became an obsession, a professional stain he could not scrub away, a tragedy that resisted all the logic of police procedure. The only clue that had ever offered a momentary flicker of hope was an unconfirmed sighting near a diner in Tucumcari, a flash of red hair, a quick glimpse of someone matching her description. But that trail dissolved into nothingness just as quickly as it appeared. The consensus settled. She had met with foul play, and her remains were likely buried deep in some desolate, unmapped patch of the desert, a secret held tight by the unforgiving sun and the indifferent sand. The case was effectively closed, relegated to the archives of unsolved mysteries, a grim tale told in hushed tones whenever the subject of the disappearing hitchhiker arose. The narrative had reached a crushing impasse, a moment of profound stasis where hope had finally utterly died. But the story, as fate would prove, was only resting, waiting for the universe to align a chain of events that would pierce the long silence with a shocking and deeply unsettling truth. Years bled into decades, and the file on Sarah Jenkins became brittle, its contents turning to faint yellow. Detective Kinsley retired, his career marked by the ghost of the young woman he could not save. The world moved on, adopting new technologies, new ways of communication, and new methods of forensic analysis that had been science fiction in 1995. It was a quiet Tuesday morning in 2015 when the first seismic shift occurred, not in Texas, but nearly 1,000 miles away in a dusty, dimly lit Oregon State Police evidence locker. The connection was tenuous, accidental, and utterly bizarre. A cold case unit performing an audit of unsolved minor crimes had decided to revisit the case of a small-time criminal named Victor Halstead, who had died in prison of a sudden heart attack 4 years prior. Halstead had been a serial petty thief and had served time for assault, but was never connected to a major violent crime. During the audit of his confiscated possessions, a sealed box labeled personal effects was opened. Inside, among a collection of cheap jewelry and faded photographs, lay a small antique glass vial. It contained the remnants of a viscous dark fluid, tattoo ink, partially dried and clotted. It was a peculiar item to hold on to for a common burglar, and the lead detective on the audit team, a young officer named Amanda Hayes, flagged it purely out of curiosity. There was no immediate context for the ink. Halstead was not known to be a tattoo artist, nor did he possess many tattoos himself. But the new protocol demanded that any organic material from an unsolved crime be submitted for updated analysis. The sample, a mere smudge of black pigment, was sent to the state lab. The initial report came back quickly. The pigment was a common commercial black ink, but the trace elements were unusual. More specifically, the presence of human organic material, a cellular inclusion, was flagged as requiring a closer look. What followed was a highly sensitive forensic examination, a microanalysis that treated the minute sample as if it were the sole remnant of an ancient relic. The lab technician, following the new painstaking DNA extraction protocols, managed to pull a partial degraded mitochondrial DNA profile from the dried cellular debris within the ink. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited exclusively from the maternal line, is not sufficient for a unique identification, but it is a powerful tool for ruling out or, crucially, establishing a familial connection. The profile was entered into the National CODIS database, not as a suspect profile, but as an unidentified victim's trace. It was a shot in the dark, a procedural formality, yet it was the beginning of the end of the mystery. The database hit was instantaneous, a jarring electronic notification that shattered 2 decades of silence. The partial profile matched the known mitochondrial DNA of the mother of Sarah Jenkins, the hitchhiker who had vanished in 1995. The genetic signature confirmed an undeniable truth. The organic matter in the vial of tattoo ink had belonged to Sarah Jenkins. This single, devastating piece of evidence instantly collapsed the distance between Oregon and Texas, between a dead petty criminal and a vanished young woman. The ink was a biological time capsule, a preserved fragment of Sarah's own physical being, held captive for 20 years. The immediate, terrifying implication was that Sarah Jenkins had not just been killed, but that her remains, or a part of them, had been used in a deliberate, sickening act of personal violation. The dark liquid in the vial was no mere souvenir. It was a trophy, an impossible clue left by a predator who had somehow incorporated his victim into his own skin. The entire narrative of the case had just been inverted, shifting from a simple disappearance into a meticulously planned, deeply personal horror show. Halstead, the supposed petty criminal, was now the prime, albeit deceased, suspect in a decades-old murder. A man whose dark secrets were literally etched beneath the surface of a seemingly mundane object. The new line of inquiry, born from a DNA trace embedded in a bottle of pigment, led a multi-state task force to completely dismantle and reconstruct the life of Victor Halstead. The man they had once dismissed as a minor nuisance now stood revealed as a potential shadow monster. His entire history was pulled into sharp focus. Investigators discovered that Halstead, far from being just a thief, had worked as a freelance, unlicensed tattoo artist for a brief period in the late 1990s, often catering to transient communities and offering his services for cash out of his dilapidated van. This detail provided the sickening context for the vial of ink. It was not just a container of pigment. It was a bespoke mixture, a customized color likely created for a client, or perhaps for his own skin. The police learned that Halstead had a penchant for mixing his own inks, experimenting with unique custom shades. The question became, why would the victim's cells be in the ink? The possibilities were gruesome, each one a twist of the knife for the surviving family. Was it a contamination, an accident during the mixing process? Or, far more sinisterly, was the organic material a deliberate ingredient, a grotesque color additive, meant to immortalize the crime on a living canvas? This macabre theory gained traction when police learned Halstead had a small, unique tattoo on his inner forearm, applied around 1996, that had always defied easy description. It was a swirling, abstract design of deep, almost iridescent black, a color he had purportedly mixed himself. The sheer malice implied by this possibility sent a shiver through even the most seasoned detectives. They secured the necessary legal orders to exhume Halstead's body. This was an unprecedented move, a forensic long shot predicated entirely on a mitochondrial match from a decades-old bottle of ink. The pressure on the forensic team was immense. The chain of custody had to be immaculate, the extraction flawless. The procedure was slow, painstaking, and conducted with a grim formality. The section of skin bearing the abstract tattoo was carefully excised, preserved, and transported to the lab for the ultimate definitive test. The goal was to compare the DNA found in the vial with the cells embedded in the tattoo itself. While they waited for the results, the task force began mapping Halstead's movements in 1995. His prison record showed he had been released from a facility in California just 3 weeks before Sarah vanished. His sister, a reluctant witness, confirmed that Victor had a history of traveling the highways, moving from state to state, doing odd jobs, often in the very areas Sarah's trail had gone cold. He owned an old beat-up pickup truck, not a semi, but a vehicle capable of cross-country travel and, crucially, large enough to haul and conceal a body. They even found an old photograph of the truck, which had been repainted several times, but in its original form bore a striking, if vague, resemblance to the description given to Sarah's mother. Every detail of Halstead's itinerant life began to align with the negative space of Sarah's disappearance. The initial assumption of a random, opportunistic truck driver had been replaced by the chilling reality of a meticulous predator who traveled and preyed in the shadows of the American highway system. The vastness of the wilderness, once viewed as an impediment to the investigation, now seemed like Halstead's deliberate hunting ground. The waiting for the forensic results was unbearable. The entire case rested on the integrity of the cellular material beneath Halstead's skin. If the DNA matched, it would not only confirm Halstead as the killer, but also reveal a profound and depraved act of desecration. It would prove that Sarah Jenkins had, in a horrifying, permanent way, become an unwilling, silent witness to her own murder, her biological signature woven into the flesh of her killer. The emotional weight of this possibility was crushing, transforming the cold case from a tragedy of loss into a chronicle of unimaginable horror. The investigators knew that the results, whether positive or negative, would finally close the open loop that had tormented a family and a police department for 20 years. The official report arrived via secure channel late on a Friday evening, a document of such gravity it silenced the bustling task force room. The results were conclusive, unambiguous, and profoundly disturbing. The full DNA analysis of the excised skin containing the abstract tattoo had yielded a powerful and complete profile. It was Sarah Jenkins's DNA, not a trace element, not a contamination, but her cellular material was conclusively identified, permanently embedded within the ink beneath Victor Halstead's skin. The initial trace from the vial had been a forensic echo, and this was the full, devastating reality. The theory, the darkest possibility the investigators had entertained, was now a confirmed fact. Victor Halstead had murdered Sarah Jenkins, and in an act of staggering, ritualistic depravity, he had mixed her biological material, perhaps pulverized bone, tissue, or blood, into the tattoo ink he applied to himself. The tattoo on his forearm was a macabre, personalized monument to his crime, a permanent confession inked onto his own body. The implication of the full DNA match shattered the last vestiges of hope for a simple explanation, forcing a horrifying new perspective on the murder. This was not a crime of opportunity that ended in a hasty burial. It was an act of personal, calculated wickedness, transforming the victim's remains into a trophy that Halstead carried with him for 2 decades. The investigation immediately pivoted from merely establishing Halstead as the killer to locating Sarah's remains, a task now imbued with an agonizing urgency. They began a methodical re-examination of Halstead's travel log from 1995, cross-referencing it with the geography of his known criminal activities. They focused on a 48-hour window between the last call from Amarillo and Halstead's documented presence at a pawn shop in Albuquerque. This short stretch of highway, known for its desolate, unmarked stretches of land, became the epicenter of the search. Aerial reconnaissance was ordered using 20-year-old satellite imagery to compare with modern topographical maps, looking for any unnatural soil disturbances, any sign of an amateur digging site. The search was further refined by the analysis of cell tower data, a technique unavailable in 1995. Halstead's sister had recalled him briefly owning a massive early model mobile phone, and the records, miraculously preserved in an archaic archive, placed his primitive device in a remote area near the Texas-New Mexico border for a continuous 6-hour period, a time frame too long for a simple pit stop. This area, a vast, unremarkable acreage of mesquite and dirt, became the final target. The task force deployed ground-penetrating radar units and canine teams, their sense of dread palpable. They were searching for a secret held by the earth for 20 years, a secret that had been whispered by a man's tattoo. The case had become a stark confrontation between the silent evidence of the flesh and the silent evidence of the soil. The moment of discovery, when it came, was not a cinematic moment of triumph, but a quiet, solemn confirmation of tragedy. The search dogs hit on a shallow, partially collapsed pit a few hundred yards from a long-abandoned service road. The excavation was carried out with painstaking care, transforming the desolate spot into a grim crime scene. What they found after hours of methodical digging were fragmented skeletal remains, carefully wrapped in what forensic analysis later identified as a canvas tarp, of the kind Halstead had used in his truck. A faded silver locket, the one her mother had last seen on her neck, was found clutched among the bones of a small hand. The remains were positively identified as Sarah Jenkins. The long nightmare was over. Sarah Jenkins had been brought home, not by a witness or a confession, but by the relentless, silent testimony of her own DNA, a fragment of her life preserved inside the skin of the man who had taken it. The identification of Sarah's remains brought a profound, if somber, resolution to the Jenkins family, trading the endless agony of uncertainty for the hard, cold finality of truth. The story of Sarah Jenkins had come to represent a new, terrifying breed of cold case, a chilling example of how advancements in forensic science could tear down the walls a criminal had built around their dark secrets. Victor Halstead, in his death, had inadvertently provided the key to his own conviction and the location of his victim. His final resting place, the prison plot where he lay, now held the remains of an identified murderer. But the story he left behind was a stark warning about the new frontier of forensic investigation. The use of a victim's DNA in a commemorative trophy, specifically within tattoo ink, became an unprecedented and horrifying detail in true crime history. The scientific community and law enforcement agencies studied the case of the DNA tattoo intensely, realizing that the same technology used to match the killer to the victim's cells could now be deployed in a revolutionary, if grim, new way. Could other unsolved cases of transient, violent criminals hold similar secrets etched beneath their skin? The idea that a killer's own body could become a biological record of their crime opened up a dark, new avenue for cold case review. The narrative of Sarah's tragedy, however, transcended the mere procedural facts of the forensic breakthrough. It was a story of a profound injustice finally answered. The emotional arc was complete. The carefree hope of a summer journey was annihilated by the dread of a sudden disappearance, replaced by the terrifying revelation of a killer's depraved act, and finally, resolved by the solemn discovery of the burial site. The investigators, particularly the retired Detective Kinsley, felt a wave of cathartic relief. He saw the case as a testament to the enduring power of forensic science and the refusal of justice to be permanently deferred. The fact that the case was solved by a young Oregon detective and a meticulous lab technician long after he had retired offered a kind of professional peace, a closing of the open wound. The memory of Sarah Jenkins was no longer tethered to a highway sign or a faded missing person flyer. She was now a symbol of resilience, her story preserved not by the killer's sick trophy, but by the determined hands of those who sought truth. The final analysis of the crime scene and the remains confirmed the initial fears of foul play, though the specific details of her last moments were mercifully obscured by time. The focus remained on the why of the trophy, the deeply unsettling motivation of a man who sought to literally contain his victim. It spoke of a profound psychological pathology, a need for permanence and absolute control that was ultimately his undoing. The silence of the Texas wilderness had finally been broken, not by the confession of a living man, but by the silent, molecular scream of DNA. The case was closed, the file marked solved. But the emotional weight of what had transpired, the sheer gravity of her suffering, and the chilling nature of the killer's secret ensured that the story of the hitchhiker whose DNA was found in tattoo ink would echo, a cautionary and somber true story for generations to come. The long road she had traveled had finally led her home, 2 decades later, a journey completed by the relentless pursuit of an invisible, microscopic truth.